Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CISO Leadership Forum. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our panel moderator. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator, Edward Ray, vCISO, NetSec Consulting. We're excited to have Edward and our panelists for a panel discussion titled Real-Time Response: How to Ramp Up Incident Response to Combat Heightened Ransomware Attacks. Welcome, Edward. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Let me introduce myself again. My name's Edward Ray. I'm the moderator. I come from sort of an incident response background, and I've been doing incident response for about 20 years. And I've had some experience in ransomware incident response as well. Let me turn it over to Erin, give her a chance to give herself a quick bio.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Logue-Smith, and I actually work for Dell Technologies. I am a lawyer by trade, working in data protection and security for about 13 years now, and I'm working in the cyber and compliance practice group in our global technology office.
Joshua?
Josh Copeland. I work at AT&T in our consulting division. My role is a security director for cyber. Essentially, I'm a vCISO for our state and local government customer base. I'm also an adjunct professor at Tulane University. Been in the field about 25 years, doing pretty much everything you can possibly imagine if it involves bits, bytes, and cybersecurity.
Well, good. Welcome, everybody. And like I said, I'm Edward Ray. I'm a vCISO, and I can remember, I think it's been almost 12 years since I wrote a research paper on ransomware, and back in that day it was Windows XP and pay $500 to get your data back, and that was the big scam of ransomware, at least when it first started out back in the early 2010s. And I fast forward up to the last couple years, in particular 2021. I had a slew of incidents from both new customers and old customers, mostly in the cloud arena. And I'm just kind of curious, Erin, from your personal experience, how has incident response in your area of the world evolved over the last, I would say, decade plus that we've seen ransomware?
Well, so I've been doing this for about 13 years, and I remember when I first started, we used to keep incident response, our incidents, security incidents on an Excel spreadsheet, and it was, very small number of them. But today, in today's world, we've never seen as much scrutiny as we have around cybersecurity in general, especially with the new SEC requirements that just came out in September. So we see this broader range from our government here in the United States and across the globe, where we're actually leaning more on these like C-suite executives, the board, to really understand what incidents are, how their company and organizations are responding to those threats, and what they're doing and what they're going to disclose to the government and to all the shareholders and investors in these companies. So it's a whole new world out there.
Joshua, I'm sure you've seen it evolve as well in the public sector. You mentioned you came from a background doing work with public governments.
Yeah, over the last probably 10 years, incident response has matured dramatically. You figure 10 years ago, you'd have a big breach and people would just go, we don't know what to do, and kind of have that paralysis of fear. Now there are run books, there are tools. There's even an entire set of professional practices of folks that will come in and do your IR for you. You have organizations like InfraGard and ISACs who are really into sharing the proper information to prevent ransomware attacks, to help you respond, give you the right tools to build your processes and your procedures around it. So it's been very interesting to see it evolve from something that was practically nothing to a very robust process for a lot of these major organizations.
Yeah, I've seen on the SMB side of things, and I'll just give the example. I'm not promoting Microsoft in any way, but M365, if you take advantage of all the different controls within it, which most people don't, there's a way to really reduce your risk, and the amount of pane, what we call panes of glass, to allow you to see certain things, is really helpful in environments like M365, which most people use, and which is one of the more exploited platforms. And I remember when I first, put together SOC, security operations centers, and managed them, we had what were called run books and playbooks, for the standard incident responses. And, I found that, over the last really 5 to 8 years, we've almost had to, I wouldn't say rewrite the playbooks, but augment them with, ransomware specific incident response techniques. And I'm kind of curious in your background, Joshua, what sort of ransomware playbooks you've put in place in your organization, and what sort of best practices you use to combat those security threats within your current or even in your past organizations. And Aaron, I'll ask the same question to you after Joshua's done.
Yeah. For me, it's all about the fundamentals, doing the right things right from the get, your patching, your system hardening, your security network configurations, having the right monitoring tools in place, doing the continuous monitoring and making sure that it's not just a SIM looking for indicators of compromise, but you're actually looking at your vulnerabilities that you have in your organization, that you have the proper security configuration to a proper best practice baseline, whether you're doing CIS, disassisted, or some vendor produced documentation. And are you doing logging? Do you have the right logs? Are they going to the right place? Are the right people being able to look at those, pull those logs in a post-breach scenario? Have you built custom alerts based off of the current threat intel for your type of organization? Because what's affecting the financial sector is not what's affecting the retail and hospitality, which is not affecting the same thing as public sector. So are you really looking at all the right things, and kind of building practices around that has been very helpful in both the pre and post breach scenarios when it comes to ransomware.
And Aaron, from sort of a legal and compliance standard, how has your job evolved from, like I said, I've been in the industry for 20 years. I remember incident response and the standard, SANS and NIST, standards to combat it from a technical perspective. And I remember having to deal with legal, but ransomware brings a whole new beast into the equation where, now you're having to deal with decisions around, do I pay or do I not? And what are the risks associated? The FBI says don't pay, but really it's a business decision. And, how has the legal and compliance framework changed for you, with ransomware?
So we basically, and a lot of the points that Joshua just brought up, around how that ransomware playbook really plays out, a lot of these questions were always cybersecurity questions. So the things that have really changed and the focus we now have to shift to is not just the cybersecurity, the vulnerability patching, the hardening of our environments. Up front, we also have to start focusing on that cyber resilience piece. So we're talking about, having to pay these ransoms, these decisions that the government's telling us, don't do that. But we have to, and again, the SEC just came out with more guidance around incident response based upon these payments and disclosures to the shareholders and things like that, what the companies are doing with their money. So, to make that legal decision around, paying the ransom or not to pay the ransom, we have to really embrace that cyber resilience strategy. Because if we protect our data, if we have, mission critical gold copy data that's backed up and accessible, and isolated from whatever the attack surface of production is, then we can get in there, get in the environment and recover our data without having to pay a ransom. We're still going to have to report on that, but the less we have to pay out, and, cyber insurance will come into play in some of these pieces too. But, having that ransomware playbook with both the cybersecurity piece and that strong cyber resiliency piece in the back end is what's really going to protect us moving forward.
Aaron, that kind of leads a little bit into the next question. You mentioned, the decisions around, whether to pay or whether not to pay. I don't know whether you heard about the MGM and the Caesar. There was a prime example of two companies, relatively large, two different approaches. One decided to pay, and they recovered quickly. One decided not to pay, and it cost them a lot more. But again, we don't know the ins and outs of the decision making, within those two organizations. But from your perspective, what recommendations can you make for organizations that are struggling to implement those appropriate security frameworks to respond, quickly, and
So, I mean, those
the
are,
SEC requirements as well too.
yeah, so those, I just got off a call this morning about those two incidents. And again, I keep bringing up the SEC requirements and I apologize for harping on that, but MGM and
Nope, they're
Caesars
they're
both
part of
decided.
they're part of a lot of organizations and having to deal with it.
Yeah, and they both disclosed. So it came into effect on September 5th. So both MGM and Caesars decided to disclose based upon what the SEC is requiring, a 4-day window for a material breach. So talking about implementing these frameworks, large companies like this, whenever they suffer these incidents, so they have so much time to do an investigation to decide whether it is a material breach or not. And that's a whole other can of worms to go down. But they have to just, once they decide that, they have 4 days to write this up and disclose to the government. So what I will say is it's very difficult to get, we have these technology teams that are now having to bridge the gap to their legal risk compliance teams and then to the board. So we really are looking at organizations now that don't understand how to get these, security frameworks, orchestrated and meet some of these SEC requirements. So my best piece of advice is to engage someone that can help you. There's a lot of vendors out there now that are doing incident response, retainer services, people that are helping you map these security frameworks like auditors and things like that. So get help and don't wait until an incident happens, because then it's really going to become difficult to get all that information together to make the appropriate call, whether to disclose or not.
And Joshua, sort of same question to you, and maybe from a public sector perspective, what sort of recommendations can you make, to those organizations that are struggling, and they may not have SEC requirements to worry about, but they have public sector, various standards that they have to meet.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that comes down to what are your risks, what are your regulatory requirements, and what tooling do you already have in place? Maybe you have easy wins that you can get that will dramatically increase your security footprint using tools that you already have. You mentioned, O365 as an option that most people are not using all the functionality that they have for that.
Oh yeah.
The same thing occurs for if they have a vulnerability scanner like Tenable. They might be only doing vulnerability scans and not doing compliance scans. You have all these tools in your stack that you might be using maybe 50% of the capability of that tool. And that's money that you don't have to reinvest. It's money you've already spent, and you can dramatically increase your security posture. And to Aaron's point, even if you're one of those organizations that decide that your playbook is to pay the ransom, now ransomware actors are, if you are a mandatory SEC reporter, if you have not reported, they're going and telling the SEC that you didn't report their breach. So you're getting it on both ends, where they'll breach you, and then if you don't do the appropriate notification, they'll notify on your behalf that you were breached. So you really need to take a look at it from a holistic point of view of what is my business impact? What are my crown jewels? What are the things that my business or my organization can't function without, and place the right value of resources against those? Do you have data? Do you need that data backed up? Are you backing it up off-site, or at least into a cloud that's not routinely connected to your environment, that they can't do the hop, skip, and a jump and get those backups too? Do you have a process and procedure that you've done and you've exercised? Not just a tabletop. Have you actually restored your backups in real time? I can count on one hand the number of times I actually have seen an organization I've gone into that say, we do, quarterly tabletops, we practice our IR response, and then I go, okay, show me how you actually do your backups. Then they'll go through the backup. I'm like, okay, now restore it. And it totally doesn't work.
Yeah, that's why I think people don't understand. They look at security and compliance as two different things. Compliance is proof that you do security well. And to what you just said, I do all these things, and an auditor or someone like you says, "Okay, show me," and that's the the best way to, in my opinion, to show that you're doing security well. Your point about challenging with tooling. One of the big challenges I found is interoperability. I just went through a painful but a good experience in making M365 and Palo Alto work well together. But it's very challenging when you have all these different tools. So what recommendation can you make to not only budget for the right tools and a finite amount of them, but try to get them to interoperate and minimize those risks of ransomware attacks? That's always been a challenge that I've had.
Yeah, and it's a challenge across the board. It doesn't matter whether you're a SMB or an enterprise. Um, Look for tools that natively play well together. Um, if you're using a SIM, what tools natively have the API integrations into that SIM? Maybe that's the road you go down because you reduce your human overhead on trying to make these things work together. You could even go down the route of, I'm just going to be a Palo Alto shop and do all of my tools from Palo Alto or all my tools from Cisco, or I'm going to go straight Microsoft and use their entire security stack, because those tools are all natively built to talk to themselves and work
Yeah.
together. Sometimes it's a matter of being cost effective, particularly if you have an organization that's going through an M&A where you have very disparate sets of tools. It's having that really hard conversation and sitting down and going, okay, what does our tooling stack look like? You have this, we have this, we have to pick one over the other, because not only is there the cost involved, but then we don't have a clear understanding of what we're protecting, how we're protecting it, and the tools that we're using to protect that. So creating those baselines and really doing your business impact analysis to figure out what's important and how you're protecting what's important cannot be stressed enough. Compliance is one thing, but compliance is not security.
Yeah.
Compliance is like literally the starting line for security. It is not your goal, it is where you start from.
Aaron, I know Dell has gone through many M&As over the last several years. Maybe you could give perhaps some of your perspective on the challenges of, integrating not just tooling, which is the question we talked about, with Joshua, but also just general corporate environments that might be different from, from different organizations, and how the challenges you've had in merging them within a common Dell framework.
So I think the biggest challenge that we've really seen, so not really, I don't really focus internally on what we're doing in Dell with our systems, but I help organizations implement technology to bolster their own cyber resilience. So I'm going to go down that path. But what I do see out there in the wild right now around, really having the budget to embrace these new strategies and putting all the tools together to work, cohesively, is that the budget is always kind of centered around that cybersecurity front end piece. And again, a lot of the focus right now is shifting towards that back end incident response, cyber resiliency piece. And Josh had mentioned, having that data isolation either up in the cloud or in a separate location on-prem. So these are newer costs that a lot of IT teams don't have the budget to cover, both that front end cybersecurity, but also that back end cyber resilience. So again, we're kind of bubbling up higher in the hierarchy to more board level decisions to really open the purse strings to really make sure that they can quickly recover that, gold copy data. Once, we're embracing the idea that it's not really a matter of if, but when. So we can have all the tools in place and they can all be working together. But the chances are that, you're going to succumb to a devastating cyber event at some point in an organization's life. We've kind of all just accepted that fact. But again, the budget hasn't really caught up to that. So we're seeing, those higher level decisions being made towards the board, and hopefully as more scrutiny is coming down from the government, we'll see board level executives understanding that the budget needs to be shifted around and more needs to be paid down to that cyber aspect.
Have you had challenges around, well, let me just ask the question directly, because you had mentioned before, what advice could you give to someone or an organization, what sort of preventative measures they can put in place in order to back up data and protect those crucial assets? Because sometimes when you get, all the best laid plans of having all those controls in place, okay, you get breached for whatever reason, okay, can I recover? What sort of recommendations can you make to make sure that you have something to recover from, and they haven't attacked that as well.
So around that piece, around that like that backup piece, we really talk about the 3 I's of cyber recovery. The first would be isolation. We really want to see some kind of physical and logical isolation of that data, and mostly your critical gold copy data, what an organization really needs to get back up and running quickly if they're all completely shut down. Then number 2, the second I is immutability. So we really want to make sure we're preserving the original integrity of that good copy mission critical data. We want to make sure, that we have some kind of analytics. So number 3 is the intelligence piece. We want that machine learning and analytics to really identify threats, but we want to make sure that those immutable copies are coming in from the backup, that they're good, that they haven't been, there's nothing wrong with them. And that intelligent piece is going to be able to tell us exactly whenever the threat actor got in there, and will help with forensics. But those 3 I's are really the most important thing we're seeing right now around that backup, to make sure that we're going to be able to get back up and running as quickly as possible.
Joshua, on your side of things, what advice can you give along the lines of making sure you have that recoverable data backed up to be able to recover to the BCDR rule, I think, is 60%, although I'm sure people want to get even better recovery than that. But what advice can you give on backing up data and protecting crucial assets?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on a lot of what Aaron mentioned. Business impact analysis, knowing what your important data is. There are so many organizations that have misprioritized what's important data to them because they don't really understand what the data does. What me as a cybersecurity professional thinks is important data is not necessarily important data to my sales team or the marketing team or the financial team. They're going to be able to best understand what's important to them and what they need to do their day-to-day mission. Having those pieces and parts together, work together, identify those things, and then create the appropriate backup plan and a tested backup plan where you're actually pulling that data back down, restoring it so that that it actually works. And then you have the 3 I's that Aaron talked about, making sure that those things are actually part of your plan, that you've built in that isolation, the immutability, the integrity of those things, and that you're going to have good material and exercise doing that. Because I guarantee you, the first time you run a play is not when you're in the real game. You want to have that absolutely practiced and down pat well before you actually have to use it. And that's the unfortunate part that we have with a lot of organizations, is that they don't consider IR until they're in the middle of IR.
Exactly.
The right time to engage with a third-party IR organization is well before you need it. Get that person on retainer, have them work and help you identify what your critical assets are, what your restoration order is. Just because I'm a security guy, I think the security tools need to come up first to protect everything. That might not be my business requirement. I might need to get my financial systems back online because I have a second and third order effect that I'm not really tracking. Great example is the ransomware from the Chinese bank that recently occurred, where because they
I just heard about that.
Yeah, because they were ransomed, they shut down all their network, and it wound up having a ripple effect in Treasury securities because they were not able to process transactions automatically. They had to put them on thumb drives and manually courier them to place to run their transactions. That's a huge,
If you remember that pipeline incident from a few years ago, the actual flowing of the oil was not the problem. They hit their financials, so they couldn't figure out how much to sell, they
could charge the billing.
Yeah, they hit the billing, so they couldn't figure. That's why they didn't turn off the spigot because of lack of oil. They turned it off because they couldn't figure out how to pay people.
Yep.
Switching back here to Aaron, one of the questions that came through, and this is always a major question: can you share any real-world examples of potential ransomware attacks that were prevented? This is more from, I'm guessing, a personal background. I can grab
Yeah,
it.
so I can't share anything along those lines where, all of our customers are under NDAs, for the most part, anyone we work with. But what I will say is that the best strategy to prevent a ransomware attack, again, it's really not a matter of if, but when. It's probably going to happen. But again, just going through all the points we talked about today, hardening your environment, having those strong security features up front, but also, again, like Josh has mentioned several times over and over, you have to, do this, not just tabletop exercises, but you have to do your pen testing, your vulnerability testing, but you really need to go in and practice your backups. Like, how long? Most people think when an incident occurs, that it can be a couple days. If they pay, especially if they pay the ransom, they're like, oh, we'll get everything back right away. It can take weeks to months, especially if the government comes in, if the FBI is in there, if they, if it's a crime scene now or things like that. So you want to really practice how quickly you're going to get back up and running before it actually happens. So that's what I'll say on that front.
Well, I can say, and this gets back to some conversations we were having before about tooling. Having multiple tools in place to be able to catch things. A real world example for me again is with that M365 Palo Alto integration. Both tools were able to work to combat and minimize. The biggest way most people get ransomware is they click on a link. And there are tools within M365 to minimize the risk of going to a bad place. And there are tools within Palo Alto, and I'm sure other tooling that will keep you from. I mean, there's always that one person in the office that clicks on everything. And that's the person you have to worry about, not so much because they're going to get ransomware. That was what the problem was 12 years ago. Now they're using them to pivot to something more interesting. And, to that, let me ask a question to you, Josh. What are some of the best strategies you would recommend to investigate attacks and identify vulnerable areas?
It comes back to know your tooling and have, very, very good understanding of what is normal in your environment. Understand where your vulnerabilities are, what things that you have that for one reason or another you can't patch. So you might be running some legacy software you must run a particular version of Java.
Exactly. Yep.
So if I know that, then I have to, one, identify that I have this vulnerability. Two, put mitigation around that. Like maybe I put that box in a segregated network where it can only talk to things that have the same vulnerability and it can't jump out to other areas. And then really just using the tools you have, make sure that you have the right logs going in, use the right, threat intelligence. Actually kind of going to the previous question of, real world example, obviously can't name names of companies, but I'd been brought in as a consultant for an organization to help beef up their SOC. And when I came in, they had good tooling, but they were running everything default alerts. They had no custom alerting,
Yeah.
anything that was tied back to their industry. So I went out, I built a bunch of alerts based off of indicators of compromise that are known for their particular segment of business, that are, those critical things for them, that are targeting the same type of tooling that they're using in their environment. And literally in the first week, we caught a attempted ransomware as somebody clicked a link, and when it phoned home using the C2 command node, that's where we caught it and we were able to shut it down. And it was one of those near misses that had it been literally a week and a half before, it would have taken down this, major business, because they had the right tooling, but they weren't using it the right way.
Yep. That's what I've seen in a lot of organizations. They turn on their SIEM and they don't optimize that SIEM to look for, when just using Microsoft Windows and Active Directory as an example, there's plenty of things you can input into your SIEM that says, when I see these 3 events in succession, I know it's a particular type of malware or a particular type of ransomware attack or whatever, and I have a run book and a playbook and how to deal with that. Because not every technical tool built around things like M365 and Cisco or whatever are going to stop everything, and that's what the SOC's for, and that's what the tooling that you're talking about is for. Some final thoughts, Aaron? We're getting close to the end here, I think. Any words
Yeah,
of
I mean,
wisdom out there for folks?
so just to continue what we were just talking about too, like it's a brand new world we're living in now. So if we're not actually trying to find, someone's trying to break in. Data is the most critical asset on the planet right now. So someone's going to try to break in. So your incident response plan needs to be up to par, but you should be having, you need tools and you need software like CyberSense through index engines that scans your backup data, because now we're entering this whole new world of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and there's all kinds of new avenues that threat actors are taking, but we can also implement a lot of these technologies and softwares to help us scan our data, make sure that our data is good and our critical assets are protected, and to identify where these threat actors are trying to penetrate. So definitely first advice is, look into an incident response retainer service to help you get some of this stuff in line if it's not working for you. But also think about all the tools that are out there between M65 and, CyberSense, Dell Technologies. We have tons of things that can help. But don't go it alone. You're gonna need some help from some of the professionals out there.
Can you make any prediction? You mentioned one, AI. Can you make any prediction as to what the biggest threats are going to be in the next year or so? You mentioned AI. AI generated attacks, I think, are definitely going to be up there.
Yeah, but I think not just the AI generated attacks, but the whole thing that makes, generative AI work is immense amounts of data. So the more data that you have around, whatever artificial intelligence, whatever you're using. So data is now a critical asset. The more data that they have, the more that the AI is going to be able to go through that data and come up with responses. So data itself needs to be protected, especially your most critical assets. So, these cyber attacks are going to be coming in just to steal the data itself for other nefarious purposes. So you really just need to protect yourselves.
Exactly. Joshua, along the same lines, any predictions that you like to make for the next year or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're going to see a lot more of attacks against business entities that are very much data centric and are going to be more willing to pay a ransom versus not pay. And we'll use some recent examples. The China bank breach, they were willing to pay because they have a business that is very time sensitive. Same thing with Caesars. They were willing to pay because being down cost them thousands and thousands of dollars per minute. Hospitals have very poor, cyber controls as a whole because they value availability over confidentiality or integrity.
Oh yeah.
Life and death. They're an organization that these attackers are going to target because they're going to pay. And when you're an organization that's seen as willing to pay, you're going to be absolutely targeted. So I would absolutely expect a breach of a cyber insurance company or an incident response company to get their customer list and then use that as a hit list, so to speak, on who I'm going to go after. Because you have cyber insurance, that means you're willing to pay. You have an IR response team on retainer, that means that you're willing to do these things. So now you're even more of a target, in addition to the industries that you are in that you're more likely to pay.
And what sort of strategies and would you recommend to use when it comes to investigating these attacks and to try to learn where these vulnerabilities are?
So it comes down to knowing your network, knowing what's in your environment, what does normal look like, and then kind of thinking like a hacker. Do the things that you need to do to protect your environment. As Aaron said, do penetration tests. Don't use the same organization, year after year, quarter after quarter. Get folks that come in and look at it differently. Figure out how they're doing their penetration test. If someone's coming in and they're doing a penetration test and all they're doing is running a uncredentialed Nessus scan against all your public IPs, that's not really a penetration test. Sometimes it's a matter of, you see something happen in the environment and you don't know where it came from, follow it back through. Think of how you would come into your environment, knowing what's out there in the public sphere. Use the tools like Shodan and Census.io that kind of tell you what you have, present it to the world.
One area that we didn't sort of touch on, and I'll ask Aaron first and then Joshua, is the area of threat intelligence. How does threat intelligence help and or hinder an organization, and how can one integrate threat intelligence into the overall scheme to reduce risk of successful ransomware attacks? Aaron, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, so I think, like I had mentioned, some of the software and tools we have is threat intelligence can't hurt, right? We can't, if we're scanning our information, if we're looking at our data and we're looking for those changes, those critical changes that would indicate that there's a ransomware penetration somehow, somewhere in the environment, it can't hurt. There's certain levels of it. You can do it in production. You can do it, we call it the cyber recovery vault, where we have our data that's been isolated and protected, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, scanning in that perspective, or scanning in the regular backups. But I think threat intelligence it doesn't hurt. And at least I'm not sure if that's the perspective that you're asking me from, but I think, anything we can do to be monitoring for any kind of ransomware variants or changes in our data integrity is what we have to do, because again, there's probably going to be somebody that clicked on the wrong email and someone is in your systems looking for something. So, we want to make sure we're always validating that the data is good, that there aren't any ransomware variants or malware variants that are, floating through the system, because they can be in there for months or years.
Yeah, different actors. It's kind of interesting. The general consensus has always been that the state actors like Russia and Eastern Europe tend to be ones that come in there and what are called smash and grab attacks, whereas China, for example, is a little bit more of a low and slow. That's I'm sure there are exceptions to each, but that's sort of the way those threat actors tend to go. Joshua, what experiences have you had with threat intel and integrating it into, you mentioned the health sector. Each sector is going to have different challenges with respect to threats and where they attack, and how helpful is that in what you do and what you recommend?
Yeah, I'm one of those folks that I'm a big proponent of getting tailored threat intelligence for your organization, your industry, the things that are important to you. I work largely with a lot of state government entities. So even understanding the, geopolitical landscape of, if you're working with a state that is very, right leaning, and there's been a new law passed for whatever thing that might cause a hacktivist attack, or might cause that type of state to be targeted over another area, and understanding kind of what those things are. We have the things that are going on right now between Israel and Hamas, Ukraine and Russia. All these things are going on. And if you're in higher ed, you have an organization that, we'll say, has a lot of pro-Hamas protests. Well, you might be seeing attacks coming in from pro-Israeli groups, or you have groups that are being very, very pro-Israeli, and you're going to see attacks coming in from pro-Palestinian groups. So even understanding the geopolitical pieces to your organization can help tailor what you're looking for and maybe where you're coming from. When the Ukraine-Russia thing kicked off, a lot of government agencies pretty much blocked off Eastern Europe IP addresses because of what happened with the WannaCry, where that was a targeted attack against a Eastern European country that just happened to escape and go everywhere. So understanding all those pieces and then applying it effectively to your own organization just makes you a better, stronger organization.
Agreed. Well, we got about 5 minutes left, actually 6 according to my clock. I wanted to take this time out to answer any questions. I saw a couple come through. Any other questions that people might have for either myself, the moderator, or Aaron or Joshua?
Yeah, I think all the questions so far are in the chat.
Yeah, and I think there were ones that were part of our discussion questions as well. So I made sure that I made sure that I covered them. Um, well, um, Aaron, Joshua, any final thoughts that you guys have? And we'll wait to see if any other questions come through.
Josh, I'll let you go first. I keep taking the first go at things.
Yeah, sure. For me, a final thought is, you know, if you're a leader in your organization for cybersecurity, a lot of times we're viewed as a cost center. We're just something that your organization spends money on with no real return on investment. And if you're really good at your job, one of the things that you're going to be able to do is demonstrate how your part of the organization is not just a cost center, but a revenue generating center where we can create efficiencies, reduce cost, where because we are a more secure organization with a higher standard of higher attestation, we've now opened the aperture to the customer base that we can serve. If you are a FedRAMP certified SaaS, now you've opened it to a whole bunch of not just federal government, but state government and all your defense industrial based organizations that are going to want that high level of assurance. So yes, you spend a lot of money on this and that's a cost, but how much money are you generating because you now have that level of attestation? So kind of flipping it on its head, understanding that cyber isn't always a cost. Sometimes it's a revenue generating event. Aaron?
Yeah, I guess final thoughts would be, again, the SEC regulation just came down, and that's for publicly traded companies. But usually in the government space, where we see something like that come down for those publicly traded companies, it won't be too long before it hits the private sector, and the government sector will be following suit. So we want to make sure that we're really embracing the idea of putting together these cyber resilience approaches. Incident response, just one piece of the overall puzzle, but it's a huge and very important piece. So I think just really starting to understand your own, your people, your personnel, your policies all around cybersecurity and cyber resilience, along with incident response, is really something that our board level people need to start to embrace, but also the technology folks have to start working well with the compliance folks and the legal folks, and it's just going to be one big happy family moving forward. So I think really starting to evaluate your incident response plans now before something happens is going to be the best foot forward.
If I could offer some advice, and this is because I'm involved in this with multiple companies right now where they're maybe starting from year zero or from a aspect of not really having their security coherent. The best way and to get your boards interested and to keep them involved is to set up things that, like, say, in the first 45 days, these are the things that I would like to accomplish, and these key performance indicators will help reduce your risk that way. And then in the next 45 days, I want to do this. And if you take that approach of incremental, you can get maybe a board that's a little reticent to get on board with security, or one that really doesn't understand it, to be able to articulate to themselves and to their shareholders or to investors, and to say, hey, these are the things that we're doing right now. Because a lot of organizations are especially third parties, are getting hit up to all of a sudden be, like, for example, SOC 2 certified, and they're like, well, how do we do that? We don't even know what that is. And you don't want to start out, well, we're going to help you get SOC 2 certified. Well, that's a path we'll get to, but start out with some quick wins that can show the board and that they're not the lowest hanging fruit on the tree. And that's probably the recommendations that I would have, is to sort of close out this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all for such an insightful panel discussion. This was great. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event.